chances are you've had a drink yourself recently, or maybe you're about to. The last time you grabbed a beer, poured a glass of wine, or had your favorite drink, you probably enjoyed it for a while and then never gave it another thought. But what you actually did was take part in one of the oldest traditions in human history. This story goes back long before people learned how to write, long before anyone planted the first crops. In fact, it starts before humans even existed. Our relationship with alcohol didn't begin a few thousand years ago with the invention of wine or the first brewery. It began nearly 10 million years ago in the forests of Africa, when a small primitive primate picked up an overripe piece of fruit that had been lying on the ground. In 2014, UC Berkeley biologist Robert Dudley published a book called The Drunken Monkey. His idea was surprisingly simple. When fruit falls from a tree, the natural sugars inside begin to break down. Wild yeast moves in, fermentation starts, and depending on the fruit, small amounts of ethanol are produced naturally. At some point, one of our ancient primate ancestors accidentally ate that fermented fruit. It had no idea what was happening or why. But it felt something new, a mild buzz, and it liked it, so it kept coming back for more. Over millions of years, our ancestors didn't just learn to tolerate alcohol, they actually evolved to seek it out. By the time early humans appeared, the taste for fermented fruit was already built into them. Eventually, curiosity took over. Instead of waiting for nature to do the work, they wanted to figure out how to make it on purpose. But how did they discover that? In 2018, archaeologists excavating a cave near Haifa, Israel, called Raqefet Cave, uncovered something remarkable. Around 13,000 years ago, the cave had been used by a group known as the Natufians. Inside, researchers found stone mortars carved directly into the bedrock. When they analyzed the residue inside those mortars, the results were shocking. They found traces of wheat and barley that had been soaked, sprouted, and deliberately left to ferment. In other words, it was beer. Your ancestors were brewing beer in caves 13,000 years ago. Now here's why that discovery matters. The Natufians weren't farmers. They hadn't invented agriculture yet. They were still hunter-gatherers, collecting wild grains by hand instead of growing them. They didn't cultivate barley. They simply gathered what nature provided. Yet beer had become so important to them that they figured out how to brew it before they figured out how to farm. And that completely changed the story archaeologists had believed for generations. For years, the accepted timeline was simple. Humans settled down, invented farming, grew grain, and only then discovered fermentation and started making alcoholic drinks. But archaeologist Brian Hayden argued that the evidence tells a very different story. According to him, people were brewing alcohol while they were still living as nomadic hunter-gatherers, and the Natufians weren't the only ones. About 1,000 years later, in what is now southeastern Turkey, someone built something extraordinary. At a place called Göbekli Tepe, enormous stone pillars, some weighing more than 10 tons, were carefully arranged in massive circles. Intricate carvings of wild animals covered their surfaces. The entire site showed incredible planning, engineering, and craftsmanship. What made it even more astonishing was that it had been built before agriculture, before pottery, and before permanent villages. The people who built it were still hunter-gatherers. For decades, archaeologists struggled to explain why nomadic people would invest so much effort hauling multi-ton stones up a hill and carving them with such precision. What could possibly motivate that kind of work? Then researchers noticed something interesting. Scattered around the site were enormous stone basins. When they examined the residue inside, they found chemical traces of fermented grain. The conclusion became hard to ignore. People weren't brewing small batches for themselves. They were producing huge quantities of alcohol for massive communal gatherings. The leading theory today is that Göbekli Tepe wasn't a town or a village at all. It was a ceremonial gathering place where people traveled from across the region, came together for rituals, feasts, and drank beer. But that raises an even bigger question, one archaeologists have debated for decades. Why did humans start farming in the first place? Archaeobotanist Patrick McGovern, one of the world's leading experts on ancient alcohol, has argued for years that humans didn't begin agriculture just to bake bread. They may have started farming because they wanted a more reliable way to brew beer. And honestly, I think he has a point, and by the end of this, you probably will too. His argument is pretty straightforward. Making bread is actually complicated, especially for early humans. You have to grind the grain, turn it into flour, knead the dough, and then bake it. Brewing beer, on the other hand, is much simpler. Soak the grain in water, leave it alone, and fermentation happens on its own. And let's be real, the desire for a drink is often a much stronger motivator than simply finding another way to eat grain. If that theory is right, then alcohol wasn't something humans invented after they settled down. It may have been one of the very reasons they started settling in the first place. By around 7000 BCE, the evidence becomes even stronger. In a Neolithic village in central China, archaeologists discovered pottery containing the remains of a fermented drink made from rice, honey, grapes, and hawthorn berries. Chemical analysis confirmed both the ingredients and the fermentation process. This is the oldest confirmed alcoholic recipe ever discovered. And it wasn't some random experiment. The ingredients had been carefully selected and blended together, showing that whoever made it knew exactly what they were doing. From there, the story only gets bigger. By the time of ancient Egypt, beer wasn't just something people drank for fun, it had become part of everyday life. The workers who built the pyramids were often paid in beer. Their daily wage was around 4 to 5 liters, not coins, not cash, but beer. And honestly, that makes perfect sense. The water from the Nile wasn't always safe to drink. But because of the brewing process, beer was often cleaner and safer than untreated water. In many cases, beer kept people alive when the water couldn't. Think about it. If you were hauling massive limestone blocks through the blazing desert heat and someone offered you a bag of coins or 5 liters of cold beer, which one would you choose? Yeah, the choice isn't exactly difficult. Beer also provided calories and nutrients. For laborers dragging multi-ton stone blocks under the Egyptian sun, those extra calories mattered. Beer wasn't just a drink. It was lunch. It even had a spiritual role. The ancient Egyptians believed that Osiris had created beer and gifted it to humanity. It was offered in temples, used in funeral rituals, and even prescribed as medicine. Egyptian physicians mixed herbs into beer to treat everything from stomach problems to infections. So this single drink has served as a paycheck, a safer source of hydration, a source of nutrition, a medicine, and even a sacred offering. When you step back and look at the whole picture, it tells an incredible story. About 10 million years ago, our primate ancestors were drawn to naturally fermented fruit because it helped them find calorie-rich food. Then, around 13,000 years ago, long before they learned how to farm, humans were already brewing alcohol on purpose inside caves. Around 12,000 years ago, humans may have built some of the first monumental structures in history for one simple reason: to gather together and drink. By 9,000 years ago, they already had established brewing recipes. By 5,000 years ago, entire civilizations were built around it. Alcohol didn't appear after we created the world we live in today. There's a very real possibility that it helped create that world in the first place. Every time you raise a glass, you're continuing a tradition that began long before our species even had a name. The brewing methods changed, the ingredients got better, the cups became more sophisticated. But the urge to drink is the same one that inspired a small primate in an African 10 million years ago to pick up an overripe piece of fruit from the ground. The only difference is, we eventually learned how to make it on purpose.